possibilities of humanitarian documentary as an entrance point to better understand how photographs in large part serve as a barometer of the metrics and analytics of our collective human condition. In other words, contemplative photography serves as a visual argument for the eradication of hunger. I spoke with someone, I saw his presentation, and he was talking about contemplative photography, Dr. Tony Bannon. And he said that these photographs cause us to want to, when these photographers take these photographs, indeed they want us to do something with these various photographs. This is James Natchaway and looking at death and famine in Somalia. This is Sebastião Salgado looking at famine in Africa. I want to close in some ways and join the discussion later. I have a full paper, but I know that the interest is in the idea of what can we do with these photographs. Are we really obligated to do anything about world hunger? Are we really obligated to do something about poverty, homelessness, and all the things that impact the human condition? For me, that was the life of Walter Rodney. I thought about it. I listened to several hours of tapes of him, of you all speaking about him, about his life. I wanted to know more about him. And I came to understand that he devoted his life to the struggle of improving life conditions for others. And I'd like to say that this is Gordon Parks' 1968 photo essay on the Fontenelle family. And it was quite a tragic story. But I think even with this photograph being presented in 1968, I don't know about you, but it still speaks to me today. It says now, little Ellen Fontenelle is in this picture. And how many times have we known mothers, children, men to go home hungry? This was the case for the Fontenelles. And I think when Gordon Parks say the cry that will be heard, I want to close with saying that it must be heard and that we must hear it, as Dr. King said, how we get to a complete life. And he said in order to get to a complete life, it must be a three-dimensional life. That life must have length, it must have breadth, and it must have height. He said in length, we have a genuine concern about ourselves. He said in breadth, we have to have a genuine concern about others. And in height, he said, we must have a relationship with our higher power. And I say today that I want to continue in some way this discussion at a later point about the power of photographs to get us involved in the human rights struggle. And I'd just like to say, as you think today, I would ask that you think of at least one photograph that has had a major impact on your life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. I will now move on. Lisa Garcia is here, and we'll have her present on climate resilience in environmental justice communities, a call for land justice and to ensure food security. Talk about timing.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, just confusion sometimes happens. Before I start, I'm going to take about 10 minutes. Before I even take 10 minutes, I want to acknowledge the First Nations indigenous peoples of this land where the library sits upon: the Cree, the Cherokee, Yamasee, Huali, Apalache, Hichiti, Oconee, Misuki, and Timucua nations. Is anybody here from any of those nations? Okay, I want to acknowledge that. The symposium, I also want to thank the Walter Rodney Foundation, Dr. Patricia Rodney, Asha Rodney, Dr. Jesse Benjamin, the board of the Walter Rodney Foundation, staff at Atlanta University and Robert W. Woodruff Library, and the distinguished panelists that I did not have a chance to meet. I greet you and thank you. The Symposium Engendering Health and Sustainable Food Systems has broken into the national conscience for the first time in years under the terms food security. My presentation, quickly, and I'm going to cut it short, Climate Resilience and Environmental Justice Communities, a call for land justice is directly related to food security, but not in this typical sense proffered by government as they define it. Rather, it is understood from a perspective from indigenous land rights, reclamation, and more recently from the notion of food sovereignty that has been recently offered to the United Nations through activism of La Via Campesina. I had this photo, or this I wanted to show you, but I wanted to make the point that we must recognize before there was a United States, there was plenty of food on our Turtle Island. That's what we reference North America, Turtle Island. We had food security back in the day, and the food security destruction system started in 1492. A prerequisite for food security is meaningful, permanent, and sustainable access to land, water, and supporting resources. When we talk about resources, in popular narrative, the dominant narrative, they say resources, land, water, biodiversity of life. We look at those as our relatives, is not necessarily resources. In Minnesota, where I grew up, second generation Boricua, Indígena, our environmental justice communities, meaning indigenous peoples, African American descendants, new immigrant populations, and other low-income communities are going to face, or are currently face the worst health, education, housing, incarceration, and other disparities, not unlike what you see being reported throughout the country in other urbanized areas. Because of that status, we are the most vulnerable to adapt and be resilient to climate change. And food insecurity is one of the most critical factors in building resiliency in communities struggling to adapt to a changing climate. So, we look first of all who was forced off this land, and land justice incorporates indigenous rights to land. In the north where I grew up in Minnesota, the first instance of food insecurity began concomitantly with the genocide of Dakota peoples, where government policies fomented food insecurity amongst indigenous nations through land grabs, the destruction of ecosystems, and the biodiversity of life. There's a photo I wanted to project, and I can't, it speaks more than a million words. But I want to talk a bit about it, and it shows the photos of a bunch of buffalo skulls piled high. And the photo was taken around 1870. And that was right after the time in Minnesota in 1863 when the grand land grab started with abrogation and nullification of treaty rights of the Dakota people. Today, back then there was about 60 million buffalo that were part of a unique ecosystem in the West, in the Plains area, in the Midwest. Today, there's only 4,000 from 60 million purebred buffalo left. They actually found them hiding in the Yellowstone National Park near Wind Cave in the Black Hills, Pacasepa, which is the home, the heart home of the Lakota Nation, which are relatives of the Dakota people. The buffalo represent a relationship with 59 indigenous nations in North America. Through a process of colonialism, neocolonialism, the idea of manifest destiny that swept through the land to so-called clean it and bring a more so-called enlightened, so-called superior way of thinking to supplant what was beautiful, came the destruction of land, and began the onset of food insecurity in this country. The idea, I want to quickly just read this piece about the United States and when they did the big land grab in Minnesota. This is actually a statute, and it's short. An act of February 16, 1863. Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress that all treaties heretofore made and entered into by the Sistian-Wahpeton, Mdewakanton, Wapakote bands of the Sioux or Dakota Indians or any of them with the United States are hereby declared to be abrogated and annulled so far as said treaties or any of them purport to impose any future obligation on the United States, and all lands and rights of occupancy within the state of Minnesota and all annuities and claims heretofore accorded to said Indians or any of them to be forfeited to the United States. That was the land grab that happened. And that actually, there's a lot that happened. You were exiled. My children's grandmother was exiled. Their relatives, and that's why you have settlements of their reservation now is in Fort Totten, Spirit Lake, North Dakota. But they were actually exiled from here. They had to leave or they would be killed, assassinated. That was the policy. And the United States government had bounties for how many Indian scalps you brought into the government. So that's the policy we're talking about. So when we talk about land justice, we're also talking about, when we talk about food security, it calls for the return of land taken from indigenous peoples. This is a form of land justice we must speak of to guarantee our food security. We also must consider a fundamental tenet that all people have a right to the land. And in environmental justice communities, I'm talking about African American people, indigenous people, new immigrant populations that are in the cities who have lost their homes. The 2008 economic crisis saw a huge amount of people of color and indigenous people subject to subprime mortgage lending. Whatever meager land they had and they could have for food security in their backyards was taken from them. In the state of Minnesota, there was a recent report that came out that just 21% of African Americans, 47% of American Indians, 45% of Latinos in the state of Minnesota own their home, while their white counterparts are enjoying a 75% home ownership rate. So home ownership is another piece